We bring you the Sacred Books and Early Literature of the East with an historical survey and descriptions by Charles Francis Horn, 1870. We found this book, Volume 3, in public domain, public access, freely available. No copyright breach or infringement was intended. And we brought this to you, to all, in video format for educational purposes alone. The Scroll of the Law, a newly found, very ancient copy of the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah, books of instruction, with its preserver, the Hebrew high priest of the Samaritans. The Sacred Books and Early Literature of the East, Volume 3, Ancient Hebrew. The earliest remains the Talmud. In translations by the American Revision Committee of the Holy Bible, W.H. Bennett, and so forth, with a brief bibliography of A.W. Oko, librarian of Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, USA, with an historical survey and description by Professor Charles F. Horn, Ph.D. Let there be light, Genesis 1:3. There never was a false God, nor was there ever really a false religion, unless you call a child a false man. Max Muller. Contents of Volume 3. Illustrations in Volume 3. Sacred Books and Early Literature of the Ancient Hebrews. Introduction. The Old Testament and the Talmud, and the two mighty treasure houses of Hebraic thought. It cannot be too often emphasized that the chief ancient literature of the Hebrews is the Old Testament of the Bible. The Christian world has so completely adopted this volume as its own that the unprofessional reader is apt to overlook the Bible's original character. It is not one book, but a collection of books. It includes every written word that the Hebrews preserved from their period of independence, that is, from the days before Nebuchadnezzar carried them captive to Babylon around 587 BC. It also includes the chief books of the later priestly state, which flourished under the protection of the Persian conquerors. That would be Cyrus. And submitted under the protection of the Persian conquerors and submitted to the domination of Rome. Hence the Bible. Oh, jeez, we've got to do this again because we fucked up. Oh my gosh, you idiot. Take 4, 5, or 6. Welcome. We bring all today this book we found in public domain, public access, so there shouldn't be any copyright claim or strike or infringements, and those weren't intentional. This is the Sacred Books and Early Literature of the East. Oh my gosh. Take 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Welcome. Today we present you with this book, Volume 3 of the Sacred Books and Early Literature of the East, with an historical survey and descriptions by Charles Francis Horn, 1870. We found this in the public domain, public access, so there shouldn't be any copyright claim or infringement, and infringement or breach wasn't intentional. We brought you this book, Volume 3, in video format for educational purposes alone. Here sits a preserver with the Scroll of the Law, or the Torah, Book of Instruction, a newly found very ancient copy at this particular time, probably prior to the 1800s, maybe, a newly found very ancient copy of the first 5 books of the Bible with its preserver, the Hebrew high priest of the Samaritans. The Sacred Books and Early Literature of the East, Volume 3, Ancient Hebrew. The earliest remains the Talmud. In translations by the American Revision Committee of the Holy Bible, W.H. Bennett, etc., etc., with a brief bibliography by A.W. Oko, librarian of Hebrew Union College, Cincinnati, USA, with an historical survey and description by Professor Charles F. Horn, Ph.D. Let there be light, Genesis 1:3. There never was a false God, nor was there ever really a false religion, unless you call a child a false man. Max Muller. Contents of Volume 3, Ancient Hebrew, etc. Illustrations in Volume 3. Sacred books and early literature. The ancient Hebrews. Sacred books and early literature of the ancient Hebrews. Introduction. The Old Testament and the Talmud, the two mighty treasure houses of Hebraic thought. It cannot be too often emphasized that the chief ancient literature of the Hebrews is the Old Testament of the Bible. The Christian world has so completely adopted this volume as its own that the unprofessional reader is apt to overlook the Bible's original character. It is not one book, but a collection of books. It includes every written word that the Hebrews preserved from their period of independence, that is, from the days before Nebuchadnezzar carried them captive to Babylon, 587 BC. It also includes the chief books of the later priestly state, which flourished under the protection of the Persian conquerors, probably under Cyrus, and submitted to the domination of Rome. Hence, the Bible is not merely a part of Hebrew literature, but the whole of that literature from its beginnings down to about 200 BC. The wonderful books of the Bible are, fortunately, within easiest access to every modern reader, and hence are not reprinted in this present series. But the reader who seeks to take with us a comprehensive view of the entire teachings and writings of the mysterious and meditative East must keep in mind that the Bible stands preeminent among them all. This would be true even if we set aside for the moment our faith in the direct inspiration of the words of the Bible and looked upon it, as we have here looked upon other literatures, solely as a surviving record of the thought and history of an antique race. Viewed in this way, the Bible presents us with, first, a clear statement of the Hebrews' religious belief as to God, the creation and the duties of man towards God and towards his fellows, or other human beings, other men. This is recorded in manuscripts, some of which may date back to Moses, 1325 BC, but which are chiefly of the centuries ranging between 800 and 400 BC. They are thus a voice speaking from the time of Assyria's power and of Egypt's decay. They tell with splendor, solemnity of God's eternal existence and universal power. They have conceived also his absolute righteousness and the wisdom and tenderness of his care for man. They had thus reached a far higher vision than the Assyrians, or even than the Egyptians at their best. True, the Hebrews still thought of the universal deity as being chiefly interested in the Hebrew people. They accounted themselves a chosen race, but this was little more than an expression of the racial confidence that they were better than other nations, and hence fitter to be chosen, a state of faith not wholly unknown among modern peoples. Another momentous thought in which this Hebraic teaching rose beyond any of its contemporaries was its close association of religion and morality. Its realization that an omnipotent God would demand of men not only reverence for him, but consideration for their fellow man, or other human beings. Not always do the early Hebraic books rise to this far-vision view of the identity of justice and divinity. Yet, on the whole, the teaching is there, and one of the proudest Jewish claims for the Talmud, their latest sacred book, is that in the Talmud this thought that our duty to our fellows is identical with our duty to God stands out clearly as the chief teaching. In the words of Rabbi Hillel, the great forerunner of Jesus, what is displeasing to thee, do not to thy fellow man. That is the whole law. Surely such words are but one step removed from the teaching of Jesus. Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. Yet it was the taking of that one step that separated Jesus from his race. And he basically said in the scriptures, do what you will to others as you would have them do to you. You reap what you sow, etc. Yet it was the taking of that one step that separated Jesus from his race. As a matter of literature, that step still separates the Old Testament and the Talmud from the Gospels of Christianity. In addition to soaring thus above the religious thought of surrounding nations, the books of the Old Testament gave to the Hebrews a knowledge of their own history far exceeding that of other races. The books record the Hebrews' descent from the old Babylonians, or rather Akkadians, of the city of Ur, their journeyings in Palestine and Egypt and Sinai, their building of a strong kingdom under David, and its gradual decline and overthrow. This tale has recently been corroborated at many points by comparison with the rediscovered records of Babylon and Egypt. Historically speaking, its narrative may possibly be exaggerated in parts, but it is based on proved facts. It is usual to discriminate two other classes of books among those which constitute the Hebrew Scriptures. These are the prophetic books, which are sermons urging the people to purer and firmer obedience to God, and the poetic books. The latter, the poetic books, from the literary standpoint, possess a special interest. The Hebrews had developed a poetic art superior to that of any of their neighbours, and so high and thoughtful was the spirit of their songs that the book of Psalms holds probably as potent an influence on the lives of men today as it has ever done. For yet another reason, the songs of the Bible call for notice here. Some of them are very old, obviously older than the books in which they are included. And he continues on. Okay, I guess you're going to get back to it because that looked like it was important. We'll just touch on that. So complete, however, was the destruction wrought upon the Hebrew cities by Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Romans, and the gnawing tooth of time, that nothing except this heroically sheltered sacred scriptures survived. Nothing, that is, except two brief inscriptions, trifling in themselves, valuable solely as curios, as the only ancient Hebrew text outside the Bible. These are the Moabite stone and the Siloam inscription. Both of them are given here within this book. When from the early Hebrew we turn to that of about the time of Christ, we meet that remarkable successor of the Old Testament, the Talmud. To this great work, the main portion of this particular volume is devoted. And as a matter of manuscripts, the oldest portion of the Talmud, called the Mishnah, or the Elder Talmud, was perhaps not written down until about the year AD 550, but wholly reliable Jewish tradition tells us that it was organized and arranged by Rabbi Judah, who died in AD 219. So they were orally, or probably singing it, chanting it to remember it before they wrote it down. Rabbi Judah is so famed for his work upon the Talmud that he is often called the rabbi as being above all others. What he did was to incorporate in this official priestly series of treatises all the accepted religious laws of his people in his time. The Jewish tradition is that the laws had existed since the time of Moses, that God gave to Moses not only the written law of the older biblical books, but also a number of unwritten laws, and that these were handed down from priest to priest. And through our research we found that the laws of the king Shuruppak, of that particular Shuruppak city in Mesopotamia, is very similar to what Moses received, i.e. the Ten Commandments and possibly those Levitical 613 laws. Very, very similar. And then you might have been the Hammurabi laws that were similar as well, but they're probably more ledgers, but yeah, they could be for trades, sales, they're like receipts, etc. But by the looks of it, they're actually laws that Hammurabi gave to his people to conform to. And there's some more on Rabbi Judah. This brings us to the interesting fact that there are really two Talmuds, or two versions of it. One of these was preserved by the rabbinical schools of Palestine, the other by those of Babylon. The Babylonian Talmud, owing largely to the labours of Rabbi Eshke, is much fuller than that of Palestine, which is commonly called the Jerusalem Talmud. Hence, modern readers, whether Jew or Gentile, have given much more consideration to the Babylonian version. It is the one adopted for this volume, though with occasional references or to additions from the Jerusalem version. There is yet another division in Talmud. Rabbinical teaching discriminates sharply between its laws and its illustrations of them, its halakha and its haggadah. These may appear either in Mishnah or Gemara, but each halachoth, halakoth, or single law wherever found is accepted literally and followed exactly. Moreover, the halakha are always written in the Aramaic language. The classic Hebrew tongue had gradually fallen out of use among the Jews, and the mass of them spoke the common Syrian or Aramaic tongue. Hence, when the Talmud has a law to lay down, it does so in the common speech that every man could understand. When it turns to argument and dispute and explanations, it more often employs the ancient Hebrew of the Bible, the language known only to priest and scholar of the Talmud's day. So in the era prior, probably, they had Aramaic Hebrew or Hebrew Aramaic. They swapped and changed for those reasons stated. This book gives a separate section to the best known of the halakha, including directions by which Jewish holy days are still conducted in our time, in modern days. Mainly, however, this volume devotes itself to the Haggadah, the tales and traditions of the Talmud. These, which are drawn almost wholly from the Gemara, completely from the Gemara, form to the ordinary reader much the more interesting part of the Talmud. The Mishnah gives us a mass of ceremonial laws, dealing chiefly with minute details of religious celebration, like the book of Leviticus in the Bible. The Gemara preserves old legends, old beliefs, 1,000 sidelights on the Bible story, 10,000 pictures of human nature, old but ever new. Hence it is to the Gemara that this present volume gives most space. The more celebrated treatises of the Mishnah are given that the reader may weigh them for himself, but the bulk of the volume is given to the stories, proverbs, and meditations of the Gemara. The earliest remains, the Bible songs. Let there be light, Genesis 1:3. Fools only see the gamut of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the book of instructions, the book of law. The more intelligent see the body, the wise see the soul. Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai. The earliest remains, introduction. The oldest fragments of Hebrew that have come down to us are some of the songs which have been incorporated in the Bible. Throughout the biblical narrative we come again and again to the phrase that someone sang this song, and in many cases this must imply that the song had existed before the narrative, that the writer of the latter, having told of the origin of some well-known chant, then inserted the chant itself. Indeed, if we are to take the Bible with the exact literalness, then the oldest words ever heard on earth, preserved to us from the first flash of its creation, are those of the stupendous command of God in the opening chapter of Genesis, let there be light. With this command, creation began, and under this command, the progressive creation of higher forms and higher thought is still advancing. They are the words which we have chosen as the motto of this series. The first piece of poetry we come to in the Bible, the first section of connected lines, presented as the extra remembered words of a person of an earlier time, is the lament of Lamech, the father of Noah. This brief chant is thus offered us as a fragment of antediluvian poetry, preserved in memory from before the deluge. As such, it holds the opening place in this volume. The chant is certainly very old. Its Hebrew wording can no longer be clearly understood, because it's an old dead language. Languages change over time, they evolve, and you have to keep up with the times. So maybe they have to have a modern vernacular, because they don't have that old dead language. Whatever comes of that. Okay, so its connection with its context is so slight that legends have been invented to explain its sense. So that if we accept this lament as the oldest piece of Hebrew literature extant, we may not be far astray. In similar fashion, we can cull several other venerable songs from the Bible text. Most celebrated among them, though with no convincing literal proof of its being an actual contemporary of its theme, is the Song of Moses and the Israelites over the destruction of Pharaoh's army.